You should play Call of Juarez Gunslinger. Seriously, that's it. Without the preamble and the fanfare throughout the rest of this video, you should play this game. If you have any love for westerns or just enjoy a solid shooter with some fun mechanics, you should play Call of Juarez Gunslinger. There's a strong caveat for anyone that'll be interested in playing the game on PC, we'll get into that later, but otherwise yeah, that's it. Now we can get into the actual video. Call of Juarez fascinates me as a franchise. It's been around for almost 20 years now, starting back in 2006 with the first release simply named Call of Juarez. The first title didn't sell very well, but it was enough to put its developers, Techland, in the general consciousness of consumers at the time. Techland has gone on to develop some pretty big hits, like the first two Dead Island games and both Dying Light entries. The first Call of Juarez was a linear shooter that followed an original story with an original character that no one really cared about, Billy Candle. Though everyone liked the secondary protagonist much more, Ray McCall, a dramatic gunslinger turned preacher who delivered lines that were harder than concrete.
Haven't laid eyes on these equalizers in 20 years. How many lives did they take? No matter. This time they won't be tools of Satan. This time we'll be guided by the light of the Lord.
It's no surprise then that the sequel, Call of Juarez Bound in Blood, was a prequel for Ray McCall and his brother, taking place nearly 2 decades before the first game. It's generally considered to be a couple notches above the first game, in terms of its overall quality, and it sold pretty well, selling 1 million units worldwide. Just to ground everyone for a second, this was in 2009, so 1 million sales was pretty good back then. They weren't gonna get laid off over these numbers like you probably would today. One more Call of Juarez game was developed before Gunslinger, that being Call of Juarez The Cartel. For some reason, Techland decided to pivot from the Old West setting and place the game in modern-day Los Angeles and Mexico, following the real-world cartel in a story spanning across 3 playable characters. The game was panned by audiences and critics for abandoning the original Old West setting, claiming that the heart of the franchise was abandoned for the sake of mass appeal with a contemporary setting. The cartel did not review or sell well, and the franchise went quiet for a little bit. That is, until 2012 when Ubisoft, the series publisher at the time, revealed an image of a cowboy sitting at a saloon, with a date written above. Call of Juarez Gunslinger was revealed the very next day, with Techland back at the helm and the franchise returning to its Old West roots, complete with legendary figures like Billy the Kid and Jesse James. Techland was seemingly trying to reassure audiences that Gunslinger would be a return to form, with many developers sharing sentiments like these. This is where the brand belongs. We tried something else, but now we're fully dedicated to the fans. Gunslinger received mostly favorable ratings from critics and audiences, and has amassed a bit of a cult following in more recent years. Yes, hi, it's me, I'm part of the cult following. The title sold well around its release, even being the 3rd best-selling game on digital storefronts in its release month. A lot of historical research was done throughout development, for each Call of Juarez title in fact, but for Gunslinger specifically, they didn't want historical accuracy to dictate what was in the game. Techland's international brand manager, Blażej Krakowiak, I'm so sorry for how I pronounced that, stated, "We didn't think it'd be interesting to focus purely on history. We have too many romantic ideas and expectations of the Old West." And I agree. I love the Old West. I'll consume any media that has even a twinge of a Western spirit or mood or vibe. So what makes me want to talk about Call of Juarez Gunslinger today? Why am I here going on and on about another 11-year-old game? Because you should play Call of Juarez Gunslinger. And if you haven't clicked off the video yet to go check it out, I guess it's up to me to tell you what you're missing out on. The narrative in Call of Juarez Gunslinger is probably the strongest component, arguably the selling point of the entire game. The story itself is simple, however the presentation and how it is shown and conveyed to the player throughout gameplay is told in a way that is wholly unique to the medium of video games. I really do recommend experiencing this story with the gameplay elements it throws at you yourself if you are at all interested after the small setup I have prepared for the story here. The story is narrated by our main character, Silas Greaves, an aging bounty hunter that's come to a saloon in Abilene, Kansas, looking for a man who wronged him many, many years ago. Silas sits at the bar and orders a drink, introducing himself to the bartender, Ben, by name. A young man, named Dwight, overhears the name Silas Greaves and invites the old gunslinger to sit with him if he's willing to share some stories from his youth. Silas can't turn down free drinks and joins Dwight at his table, along with Jack, a middle-aged patron with a chip on his shoulder, and Seth, another fan of old cowboy stories. Molly, a barmaid, brings Silas a drink, and Silas begins telling the group in the bar about his time running with the famous outlaw, Billy the Kid, to lead him to the man he had been hunting, Roscoe Bob Bryant. Keep that name in mind, we won't be mentioning him again for a while. Silas recounts a story of meeting Billy the Kid just as the law had descended upon them, fighting off dozens of lawmen, then making a daring run to stables nearby to retrieve horses for Billy and company to escape on. Dwight interrupts Silas, having read this story in A Penny Dreadful, and Dwight tells the story of Silas Greaves gunning down Sheriff Pat Garrett in an honorable duel. Silas corrects the narrative, saying that isn't what happened when he met Pat Garrett, rewinding gameplay for the player as Silas backs up in the story, placing the player back at the beginning of the road down to the stables. In Silas's version that we are now playing out, the sheriff got the drop on Silas, mistaking him for Billy the Kid, but arresting him anyways since he was affiliated with the kid. Dwight asks if that's the end of the tale, and Silas says,
"Boy, that was just the beginning."
The reveal of Silas being more in control of what the player is experiencing should intrigue the player to see what else Silas is capable of in his stories, how it might affect gameplay, and how it can play out in this interactive medium. Silas directly affecting the world, gameplay mechanics, and the environments around the player picks up more and more throughout the campaign, and it gets a little difficult to talk about the levels and gameplay without spoiling any more of this for you, if you are curious to experience the game yourself. The rest of this section is going to mostly be about the narrative, but I will interject with aspects of the gameplay that Silas directly influences or is entirely in control of, for the sake of saving spoilers from the core gameplay section later in this video. So with that, here is your spoiler warning. I want to emphasize one more time, this game is worth your time, it is worth playing. It's a pretty short title, you could finish it in an afternoon or two. But the ride it takes you on is a celebration of the Old West and a fantastic romp with the usual constructs of what make a video game interactive and how the player directly engages or clashes with a typical narrative. The designers and writers of Call of Juarez Gunslinger directly cite and attribute ludonarrative dissonance, a term that people throw around to sound a lot smarter in these kinds of videos. Essentially, it means that the gameplay within a game is directly contrasting with what the narrative is telling you or expecting you to think. A common example is the Uncharted franchise. Nathan Drake is a handsome, charismatic, likable guy that you'd probably love to talk to and be happy to go to his barbecue on the weekend. Yet in gameplay, as the player controlling Nathan Drake, you are slaughtering hundreds if not thousands of men across the Uncharted series. It creates a disconnect between the character you know and the character you control. That's not the case for Gunslinger. Silas is a killer. He's larger than life, and you better believe that he's killed 1,000 men single-handedly. He believes it, he affirms it, and he swears by it. The design team took this concept that games seem to struggle with and ran with it, playing into the framing of Old West stories from an aging cowboy telling some tall tales to get some free drinks. I want to mention all of this because the story this game is telling, the story that Silas is telling, is a story that should not be believed. As we continue throughout the game, Silas's actions and exploits become more and more grandiose, becoming more and more mythical rather than factual. Silas's story continues almost immediately where he left off, waking up in a cell in the town of Lincoln, following his arrest as part of Billy the Kid's gang. Silas says that he was freed by Billy himself, throwing his keys through a window into his room. Silas leaves his cell and helps himself to Sheriff Bob Ollinger's shotgun, using it to blast his way to freedom, up to the roof of the building. Silas seems to realize that he's written himself into a hole here. The buildings up here are too far apart for him to believably traverse the rooftops. So he tells it as if there were convenient planks between the buildings, guiding him to his destination, and as he does so, these planks fall into place for the player to follow. Silas continues through town, until reaching the stables to escape on a horse. There he is confronted by the sheriff, of whom Silas recently acquired a shotgun from. Bob Ollinger says that he isn't going to let Silas leave the town, so Silas and Bob duel right then and there. Silas says that he killed the sheriff honorably, and Billy the Kid escaped as well, though he was gunned down just a few months later. I think this leads us nicely into a tangent about the main collectible of the game, Nuggets of Truth. These are scattered throughout every level, usually pertaining to the actions that Silas is doing in the level or the major players in this part of his tale. They're flavored as playing cards in the menu in-game, and they all tell you about the real-life figures that the game takes inspiration from, like Billy the Kid, or actions and objects from the time period, like horse theft or Gatling guns. They exist as kind of a fact check to Silas's lies. If he involves someone like Jesse James in his story, the game corrects the narrative and lets you read real-world knowledge about James, if you care to do so. They're a fun idea for the world of Gunslinger, a world of lies and deceit, and they just bolster and support the love that the development team claimed to have for the Old West. After escaping jail and taking down Bob Ollinger, Silas joins a gang in Mexico, the Rurales. The real-world Rurales were a militant police force founded by the then-president of Mexico, Benito Juarez, serving to counter the many bandit groups in Mexico at the time. So, you know, kind of the opposite of a gang. Anyways, Silas joins them to lie low from the United States law for a while. Silas claims that he was employed to help the Rurales fight back against a gang, the Cowboys. A very unique name, thanks guys. As Silas begins his story, he happens upon a group of the Cowboys robbing a stagecoach, and he decides to attack the gang head-on by himself. As he fights, more of the gang appear and ambush Silas from above, and Silas says they approached from above, like the Apaches often did, with the game changing the character models that you are fighting to that of Native Americans. Silas gets carried up in his Apache analogy and claims to have been fighting Apaches themselves, only to get corrected and claim he only ever said they were fighting like Apaches. When he corrects himself, the Native American fighters turn back into the cowboy gang. Silas gets overwhelmed, claiming it was only because he was running out of ammo, which directly impacts the player as suddenly your surplus of ammo begins to dwindle quickly. Silas writes a path into the cave into the narrative, presenting the cave suddenly in front of the player, and he runs inside, with the cowboy gang in pursuit. Silas runs through the cave for a while, suddenly realizing he's writing himself into a literal hole. He then claims that an old Native American warrior was laid to rest right in front of him, with the ammo that would help him turn the tides of this chase. He also conveniently finds some dynamite, and now the hunted becomes the hunter. Silas chases the gang out of the cave and finds the leader of the gang, Old Man Clanton. A boss fight breaks out, the first of many in the game, but we'll talk more about these in detail later. Silas kills Clanton and begins his next story, still supposedly riding with the Rurales. The next tale picks up a few months later. Silas has tracked down a man who wronged him in his past, a Johnny Ringo. He's supposedly taken refuge with the remnants of the cowboy gang and their new leader, Curly Bill, in a sawmill up in Arizona. Silas fights through the sawmill, chasing Johnny Ringo and mowing down the cowboys all by himself. Jack, a patron of the saloon, interrupts Silas to express doubt that he killed so many men himself. Silas mostly ignores this comment and continues on, until he's stopped by Curly Bill in the lumberyard. A boss fight breaks out, and Silas says that Ringo escaped while he was dealing with Curly Bill. Jack interrupts again and says he knew something was up with this story, since he had read that Johnny Ringo's body was found far from Arizona, months after Silas's story would have taken place. Silas agrees, saying that must have been when he caught up with Ringo and killed Ringo himself, telling the patrons of the saloon that the legend of Doc Holliday tracking down Ringo wasn't true, and that most of those old cowboy stories aren't true either. After taking out Ringo and being paid by the Rurales to help stop the cowboy gang, Silas decides to become a full-time bounty hunter on his own to fund his quest for revenge against men who wronged him many years ago. His first official bounty hunt was to catch or kill Henry Plummer, a sheriff-turned-outlaw leading a gang for the pursuit of wealth that could be stolen from gold mines. Silas tracks the gang and Plummer to a gold mine and tries to ambush them at the site. Silas creates a narrative of him entering the mouth of the cave, fighting through the twisted paths of the cave, narrowly avoiding blowing himself up with all the dynamite that stayed down there, until he reaches the end of the cave, realizing how outlandish the story has become, with a literal explosive ending of him jumping out of the cave, shooting 6 men in his descent, and landing in a pool of water below. He claims that this is just what he envisioned in his head, that of course that isn't how it happened. Silas rewinds the player again, and instead of entering the cave, he chooses to walk on a scaffolding outside of the cave, used to transport the ore and equipment. A ladder suddenly appears for the player to access the scaffolding, and Silas continues through, until he meets Henry Plummer. Another boss fight breaks out with Silas besting Plumber and officially completing his first solo hunt. Steve, the older patron in the bar, asks Silas if he ever did find that man he had supposedly been chasing, Roscoe Bob Bryant. Silas says he'll get to that part, and Ben, the bartender, asks Silas where he thinks Bob Bryant went. Silas notices Ben's curiosity, asking why he asked, and Ben backs down, saying he was just wondering. Silas spins up a new story in media res, fighting into the very saloon that he and his audience were sitting in today, to chase after John Wesley Hardin, who has apparently been on the run with Roscoe Bob Bryant. Silas decides that this story in particular is moving too quickly, and he tells Ben that he thinks Hardin deserves a bit more build-up before he takes him down. Silas backs the story up again, placing the player right outside of Abilene, and he shoots through Hardin's gang until reaching the saloon again. Silas enters the saloon one more time, finding that Hardin is not present. Hardin ambushes Silas, coming through the front door behind him, and the two duel right here. Hardin runs out of bullets in the duel, and Silas arrests him. Silas wraps up the story by asking for another round of drinks, speaking directly to Ben and asking him to serve them himself. Silas and company are served another round of drinks, and Ben redirects Silas's story into something other than his hunt for Bob Bryant, asking if he ever had a run-in with Native Americans. Silas obliges, saying that he once hunted down a Native American chief and gang leader, Grey Wolf. This part is going to get a little disrespectful to Native American culture with its out-of-touch representation, but bear with me here. I'm just telling it how the game tells it. Silas fights through the mountains, killing many Apache men in his pursuit of Grey Wolf. Reaching a cave, Silas enters and walks through a calm corridor until reaching a peaceful grotto, where Grey Wolf presents himself to Silas unarmed, and saying,
"You carry great darkness in your heart, and if you do not release it, it will claim your soul."
Silas disregards what he says here, being vaguely racist and dismissive of what Grey Wolf says, but has a vision brought on by Grey Wolf's speech. Silas sees himself killing many men, while Grey Wolf tells him that he will return to the place he is visualizing one day, on a dark path fueled by killing, his soul irredeemable. Silas neglects telling these specifics from Grey Wolf to his audience, instead saying that Grey Wolf was telling him how fearsome of a warrior he was, quote, unequaled to any pale-faced warrior. Grey Wolf continues in the vision. Again, Grey Wolf's true speech is only being relayed to the player, and presumably Silas at the time. Grey Wolf says that the spirits of Silas's past will haunt him one day. Silas continues to misunderstand or ignore Grey Wolf's warning and keeps on gunning down the men in his vision. The vision ends, and Silas is attacked by more Native American men and continues to chase down Grey Wolf, until Grey Wolf seemingly vanishes, and Silas never sees him again. Jack once again questions the validity of Silas's stories, and Silas agrees with him that sometimes his tales of adventures are exaggerated, but that doesn't make them not true. Dwight interrupts to mention a story about Silas that he's familiar with, the day that Silas took down the Dalton brothers and their gang during a heist in Coffeyville. Ben interrupts Dwight, saying that he was there himself, so he knows what happened. Ben narrates a brief section of the story, telling about how he and a local militia took down the Dalton brother gang, a short story of a town coming together to defend their property from lowly bandits. Dwight stops Ben's story, saying that he read all about this day and he knows what really happened. Dwight begins an embellished version of events, seeing the player off as Silas deputized by the local law, helping the lawmen fight off the Dalton brother gang mid-heist. In Dwight's version, Silas Greaves hatches a brilliant plan to sneak around the building and enter through a hatch on the roof, catching the gang inside while they're distracted by the law. Silas corrects the story one last time, telling everyone what really happened, and the level is once again rewound, placing the player on the outskirts of town, heading in right in the middle of the conflict. Silas says that the lawmen were being picked off, while the Dalton brothers themselves were making an escape. Silas says a lot of the town were on the side of the Dalton brothers, the brothers being friends or family with most of the town, so Silas had to fight his way through everyone in town to reach the Dalton brothers on the other end of Coffeyville. Two of the Dalton brothers escaped, while one other brother, Emmett Dalton, stayed back to hold off Silas. Silas and Emmett fight, and Silas claims that he killed him that day. Ben corrects the story, saying that he was the only known survivor of the robbery, with Dwight corroborating that Emmett Dalton survived being shot 25 times. Silas tries to backpedal a bit and says, well, who do you think put all those bullets in him? Silas continues with a story of tracking down the Dalton brothers and their gang, picking up the story somewhere in Missouri, in a swamp in the middle of a mountain range, with a local group of vigilantes accompanying him on the hunt. Silas was trekking through the waters alone, while the vigilantes were searching on the cliffs surrounding him. Suddenly, fog rolls in, and Silas is trapped in the swamp alone, without his backup to watch over him. Silas notices Steve, the older patron in the bar, is falling asleep, so he throws in some Apache warriors into the story to see if he's paying attention, having the player suddenly fight the Native Americans in the middle of this hunt. Steve wisens up, saying that he is paying attention, and Dwight steers Silas back on track of his pursuit of the Daltons. While wading through the swamp, Silas says that he happened upon a steamboat in the middle of a marsh in a mountain range in Missouri. Ben and Steve question the validity of finding a steamboat in a place like this, and Silas writes them off, saying he didn't know how it got there, but he knows what he saw. Some of the Dalton men are waiting on the boat, and Silas decides he needs to fight through it to find the brothers. Silas reaches the top of the boat, where a vigilante he recognizes is waiting for him. The vigilante guides Silas into the top cabin, knocking him out as he steps through the door. The steamboat is then lit on fire while Silas is unconscious inside, but Silas wakes up in time and begins to make his escape. Steve, Jack, and Molly question the accuracy of Silas's description of the layout of the boat, saying it sounds more like an ocean liner. The three get caught up in the discussion of the boat, even mentioning the launch of the Titanic that is supposedly happening next year, and Silas gets frustrated with the group since they aren't listening to him. Dwight steers everyone back on course to Silas's story, and as he breaks out into open air, the Dalton brothers gang is waiting for him. Conveniently, there just so happens to be a Gatling gun waiting for Silas so he can mow down the dozens of bandits. After bringing the gang down to just 2 members, the 2 remaining Dalton brothers, Silas duels the both of them in an honorable fight, killing both in one swift movement. It's now that Silas suddenly opens up to his audience about what he's really telling these stories for. Silas feels empathy for having gunned down these 2 brothers, knowing their frustration and pain of losing family. Silas begins a story from long ago, a tale of him and his brothers gambling in a town in Mexico. The Greaves brothers won big that night, and were followed out of town by some miscreants, looking to take their winnings. The men who followed them were led by none other than Roscoe Bob Bryant. Bryant has the brothers hung by their necks on a branch of a tree nearby. Bryant then places a single coin from their winnings in Silas's mouth, saying he wouldn't leave them with nothing. Bryant and his men leave the 3 to hang, but after a few moments the branch breaks under the weight of the 3 men. Silas, being the youngest and the smallest, was the only one not to suffocate under the weight pulled by the rope. Silas swore revenge against Bob Bryant, and the 2 men that he was with, Johnny Ringo, whom we've already dealt with, and another man that Silas simply refers to as Jim. Silas continues his story, saying that he once heard that Roscoe Bob Bryant was riding with a gang called the Wild Bunch, led by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Silas had followed them to one of their heists, though only getting involved once their plan had gotten in motion. The Wild Bunch blew out the supports of a bridge, causing a train to fall into the gorge below, where the train would be at the mercy of the Wild Bunch, free for them to pilfer it of its contents. Silas tells the story of him climbing the remains of the train hanging from the bridge, and fighting his way through the Wild Bunch to find Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and Bob Bryant. Instead, Silas finds George Curry, a notorious member of the gang, and duels him in the remains of the train. Silas begins a tale of another Wild Bunch heist that he got involved with, this time preventing the heist before the gang could blow a train off of a bridge. Silas tells the story of him heroically defusing many bundles of dynamite tied around the base and supports of the bridge, while fighting the Wild Bunch gang up to the top. At the top, Silas is confronted by another leader of the gang, Kid Curry, not to be confused with George Curry, who he just killed last time. This begins the worst boss fight of the game, and we'll dig into these properly later, I promise. With Curry wounded and defeated, Silas asks him about Bob Bryant's whereabouts. Kid Curry tells Silas that Bob and the others fled to South America and attempts to shoot Silas with his last breath. Silas reacts faster, executing Kid Curry here. Ben asks if Silas thinks that Bob Bryant really got away, and Silas continues saying that at that moment he had decided to go after his brother's other killer, the one referred to as Jim, who was running with Jesse James and his gang. Silas again claims to stop this gang mid-train heist, this time while the train is barreling down the tracks somewhere in the countryside. Silas fights through a train again, and somewhere along the length of the train, Silas excuses himself to go to the bathroom in a pretty distasteful way.
Suddenly I have an urgent need to drain my one-eyed snake.
With Silas gone, the player is stuck walking through an endless repeating train car while the patrons of the saloon begin to talk amongst themselves about Silas and his stories. Jack claims that he's an old drunk cheating them out of free drinks, while Dwight reaffirms his beliefs of these old gunslinger tales. Molly tries to calm Jack, but Jack doubles down, not believing a word out of Silas's mouth. Silas returns, picking up where he left off, and from here, Jack begins antagonizing Silas a bit while he narrates. Silas usually doesn't mind the confrontation, writing Jack off by saying he might be embellishing or that might not be exactly how it happened, but he's telling the story anyways. Reaching the engine car, Silas duels Jesse James. Ben interjects to say that everyone knows that Jesse James was killed by Bob Ford just a few months ago, and Silas agrees, saying,
Guess it doesn't matter how far you run, does it, Ben? Your past always catches up with you.
Ben goes quiet, and Silas continues by saying he didn't kill James in the duel, just wounded him while his target Jim got away. Silas begins his next chapter picking up the trail on the Wild Bunch, now led by Jesse's brother Frank James and the mononymous Jim. Silas kills some more random Native Americans. In his defense this time, they shot at him first, at least in his retelling. While narrating, Silas asks Ben directly for a whiskey, stating that there's nothing better to soothe a troubled soul. Ben remains quiet, not serving Silas or responding to him whatsoever. Silas continues being vaguely racist towards Native Americans in his narration, but mentions Grey Wolf's message and warning, seemingly remembering some of what Grey Wolf was actually trying to tell him. And here, it should click with the player that they have returned to where Grey Wolf showed Silas in his vision. And here, Silas has returned, on a dark path of vengeance. Silas guns down many more men where seemingly he, in the actual moment, not the narration, gets a flashback of the vision, however playing out as he's gunning down the last of the Wild Bunch gang, not a vision anymore, but reality. Ben finally speaks up, asking Silas if he ever found the last man he was after. Silas doesn't answer him, instead asking Ben a question himself. A pretty simple one. Ben, do you ever think about death? And right here, one of my favorite moments in the game, potentially one of my favorite moments in any Western, happens. Silas sings a song from the perspective of a man begging death to give him more time, to not take him now as he's not ready to die.
Oh, death, oh, death, won't you spare me over till another year? What is this that I can't see with ice cold hands taking hold of me? Well, I am death, none can excel. I'll open the door to heaven or hell. Oh, death, oh, death, won't you spare me over till another year?
It's a beautiful moment in an otherwise action-packed, lighthearted game. It comes out of nowhere, it's dark and somber, and it's a great performance from Silas's voice actor, the late John Saigon. It leans heavily on a Western cliché, a sad, tired old cowboy wondering about his fate, and after the moment of Silas seemingly confronting Ben, it comes around like a left hook. It's the only time the game takes a moment to pause from the action, not to tell a joke or mess with the level design, and I think it really shines. It really is a wonderful moment. After his singing, Ben presses Silas again, asking if he ever did find Jim Reed. At this moment, after Silas has been referring to him exclusively by his first name, you can practically hear Silas smiling at Ben confirming his last name.
Was indeed that son-bitch's surname. That's right, Ben.
Silas continues his story after Ben's question, continuing the tale of pursuing Frank James and Jim Reed. He follows Frank up a mountain while avoiding the sniper fire from him and his gang until he reaches Frank's sniper perch on the edge of a cliff. A sort of boss fight begins with Silas blowing the building off of the cliff, saying Frank James fell off with it. Dwight corrects Silas, saying that Frank James hasn't died, he's been giving guided tours at the James Ranch. Silas twists this in saying that he never said Frank died when he fell, and he just continues on with his story, moving on to Jim Reed. Silas kills the last of the Wild Bunch gang and duels Jim Reed, repaying him for what he did to his brothers. Silas decides that it's time to head to bed, but Dwight exclaims that it sure is a shame that Silas never found Roscoe Bob Bryant himself. Silas says he did actually have one more crack at Bryant when he heard that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were back in the States, trying to start up their old gang. Silas pursued them, with the assumption that Bryant was with them. 40 years after his brother's death and only 6 months prior to him sitting in the bar with them today. Silas's story begins with him fighting through the gang in the forest, reflecting on if he would even recognize Bob Bryant today and if what he's done to find him has been worth it. Ben chirps in and says maybe it isn't worth chasing him, but Silas doubles down on wanting revenge. As Silas navigates through an old, dilapidated ghost town, he continues to fight through the gang, until reaching an ambush with many of the Wild Bunch. Silas fights them off for a while, but suddenly an explosion knocks him unconscious. When Silas wakes up, the Wild Bunch are gone, and he begins walking through the ghost town again. Suddenly, he swears that he saw Billy the Kid, at least a ghostly apparition of him. Silas fights off the ghost, then another appears, one of Sheriff Pat Garrett. He fights that ghost too, then more keep coming. Silas is faced with the ghosts of every man he's been sent to kill and every man that he killed for himself. Henry Plummer, John Wesley Hardin, Robert Ollinger, every figure and every man he's killed is back to haunt him and trying to drag him to the grave with them. Silas reaches a graveyard, fighting off many more ghosts until finally the Sundance Kid shows his face. Silas battles him, seemingly killing him in the fight. Then Butch Cassidy makes an appearance, thanking Silas for finishing off Sundance. That is, until he realizes that Silas is here to kill him too. Sundance rises back up, not quite out of the fight yet, and the three have a standoff. Silas claims to have gunned both men down himself, right then and there. Jack confronts Silas for his stories one more time, saying that it's a known fact that Butch and Sundance were gunned down in South America. Ben asks if he ever did find Bob Bryant, and Jack gets in by saying there is no Bob and that none of what Silas has said tonight has been true. Silas concedes, admitting again that he does like to tell an exciting story. And exciting is right, as Silas confronts Ben, calling him Bob and telling him again, "Your past always catches up with you." Ben panics, realizing that Silas is onto him and knows who he is, pleading for his life and telling him that he was a different man then, that he would go back and change things if he could. Silas doesn't buy it and tells him he can't change things. What's done is done. Here, the player is given a binary choice to get revenge on Roscoe Bob Bryant or to forgive Ben and believe his path of redemption. The revenge option has Silas dueling Ben, a fragile old man with one last duel for the player as well. Silas guns down Ben, or Bob Bryant, finally putting the last nail in the coffin of Silas's dark, vengeful life. His audience asks if Silas knew the entire time, to which Silas admits that he had his suspicions the moment he walked in, but when Ben said Jim Reed's last name, that confirmed it. The patrons ask Silas where he'll go now, and Silas says that it doesn't really matter. He sold his soul for revenge a long time ago. Silas exits the bar and the credits begin. The redemption option has Silas forgiving Ben, saying that Silas has unfortunately fallen to becoming the opposite of Ben. Bob was a killer and decided to move on from that life and become Ben, while Silas was leading a normal life until he decided on chasing Bob and leaving a trail of bodies behind him, more than Bob ever likely killed. Silas gives Ben that coin that Bob once placed in Silas's mouth many years ago, making sure that he doesn't leave him with nothing. Silas leaves the saloon and the credits roll. And that's the story of Call of Juarez Gunslinger. The story of Silas Greaves, the story of a man driven by revenge and only fueled by gunpowder and blood. It's an exciting ride through an Old West tall tale, and it doesn't overstay its welcome with a short runtime, wrapping up its main plot thread nicely in either ending. Personally, I prefer the revenge ending. The game has told us that Bob Bryant was a menace. He personally killed Silas's brothers, he's been running with gangs, and clearly, Silas is still motivated by his vengeance. Forgiving Ben in the redemption ending kinda feels like a cop-out to give Silas some salvation, to put him in the light of a hero rather than just leaving him a cold-blooded killer. But frankly, I think that's all Silas Greaves really is, or rather what he's become. He is a killer. He'll brag about the hundreds of men he's killed, and he'll have a smile on his face while he tells you. Surprisingly, it seems like people disagree with me. Take this with a grain of salt, probably the biggest grain on Earth, as I'm going solely off Steam achievements, Xbox achievements, and PlayStation trophies here, but the redemption ending consistently has more people having gotten this ending than the revenge one. I don't know, revenge to me feels like it always would have been Silas's main goal. He doesn't have to be an honorable character. He isn't an honorable character. Again, the game has shown us that throughout the gameplay and how much he revels in his stories. Ironically, I think the redemption ending is where the disconnect between narrative and gameplay is at its strongest, and unfortunately I'm not sure if that was intentional by the writers. All in all, a very fun, exciting short story that has a pretty good reveal with a satisfying conclusion. If you pick the right ending. I'm definitely not biased. Call of Juarez Gunslinger, if you can believe it, is a Western first-person shooter. It's a quick, snappy shooter with surprisingly fluid movement and solid shooting mechanics. Though right from the get-go, I want to point out some negatives I have with the design of the game, since the rest of this section is going to be a lot of praise for what Gunslinger has in store. This game is short. Extremely short. It had about a 5-hour runtime for me playing through the game for the first time for the video. This runtime is including all cutscenes and load times, I'm just adding up the length of my footage. Granted, it's probably the 4th time I've played through the game myself, but I was taking notes throughout my first playthrough, so I'd say my speed of playing through a familiar game was balanced out by constant note-taking. Just for fun, I played through the game again on True West and ended up finishing the game in just over 3 hours in a single afternoon. One other strike against the game is the repetitive nature of its core gameplay loop. Gunslinger is a corridor shooter in its level design, meaning you fight enemies in linear spaces, traveling a predetermined straight path in a level, and it doesn't deviate much from this, with few exceptions, like a level where you're stuck in a foggy swamp, forced to explore around to find the correct path. Don't get me wrong, it isn't a fault of Gunslinger that it is a narrative, linear game, but it might start to bug you after a while someone else wasn't engrossed enough in the story or engaged by the combat and gameplay that they wouldn't be too bothered by the similar feeling levels and progression. Speaking of those things, let's get into the good stuff. After the narrative, Gunslinger is an arcade shooter first and foremost, awarding the player points for kill combos and utilizing specific techniques with a lot of room for a high skill ceiling. The game doesn't grade you on your performance or anything, but the point system does affect gameplay and the player directly, also being the system that doles out XP or experience points for the player to level up and get more skills. We'll dive into those skills in a second, let's stay on topic with the point system. The point system gives the player intrinsic motivation, meaning it rewards the player for having fun and playing the game in interesting ways. You'll rack up more points the faster and more interesting ways you kill enemies, like getting a headshot streak, killing multiple enemies with an explosion, or even ricocheting bullets. The point system also gives us extrinsic motivation, giving experience points like I just mentioned a moment ago. Your score is 1-to-1 with your XP gains, which requires you to get a certain amount of XP to level up. When you level up, you get skill points, which unlock new skills for the player, with almost each one mixing up how you play or adding new mechanics into the core gameplay. Let's take a look at some of these skills. The game breaks up the skill trees into 3 classes, though you'll most likely be investing in all 3 throughout your playthrough. There's a class for pistols and dual wielding, a class for rifles and sharpshooting, and a class for shotguns and explosives. Each one has skills that pertain to their weapon types, like increasing the spread of your shotgun or unlocking the Eagle Eye skill, where if you aim down sights for a moment, you'll trigger a slow time effect and zoom in slightly. A lot of skills focus around the player's active ability, concentration. It's a bullet time-like mechanic, slowing down the world while the player retains their aiming speed and desaturating the world, highlighting enemies in a red glow and even slowing down bullets slow enough that you can manually dodge them yourself, following the bullet trail. Concentration is built up over time for each kill, and again, a lot of skills revolve around concentration, making it an extremely powerful and versatile ability. Skills like Executioner, where if you hold down the concentration activation key, you'll mark as many enemies in front of you as you have bullets in your gun, mowing them down in quick instant headshots. Or the Devil Shotgun skill, where your shotguns will not need to be reloaded and you can continuously fire your double barrel until the concentration meter runs out, you run out of ammo, or there's no one left to shoot. Brief tangent for my sake, there's an active reload ability for both the rifle and revolvers in the game, and I love this skill. I love an active reload in any game. I think making reloading more interesting and engaging is a fun way to mix up shooting in a shooter, and I think it pays off in Gunslinger. It's an optional skill, and engaging with it is optional after you unlock it. The animation for reloading changes for both weapon types too, really adding to that feeling of your character getting better with skill progression. The skill trees are laid out in such a way that the player is forced to invest in both sides of a skill tree, meaning that if you go down the shotgun explosive tree, you'll be forced to get both skill types, you can't just avoid one. And I like this, it encourages and sort of forces the player to at least try out the new skills for every type of play style. The last core mechanic of gameplay is an ability that the game calls Sense of Death. This is an ability on cooldown allowing the player to dodge a fatal shot once, slowing down time to zoom in on the player's potential killer, asking the player to dodge in the opposite direction of the bullet. It's a fun, exaggerated way to give a player a second chance in intense fights, and it has a few skills that can make it even more effective, like a skill to instantly snap your crosshair on your would-be killer and activating concentration automatically upon killing them. Let's talk a bit more about what you'll be gunning folks down with anyways. We've talked about the skills of them, but we haven't mentioned the specific tools you'll be using. It's a western, so of course we have some revolvers. There's 3 revolver types, the quick shooter, the 6-shooter, and the ranger. The quick shooter shoots quick, raise your hand if you could have guessed that. It has low damage and high damage drop off, though making up for it with a fast ADS speed, or aim down sight speed. It also has the quickest reload speed in the game, being a break action revolver coming with a speed loader to refill the cylinder quickly. The 6-shooter is the middle ground of revolvers, shooting with middle of the line damage, firing slightly slower than the quick shooter, and it reloads 1 bullet at a time. The ranger is the sharpshooter's pistol. It has high damage, high range, and fires the slowest, and of course loads bullets 1 by 1 into the cylinder. There's upgraded versions of both the 6-shooter and the quick shooter. The ranger revolver is technically already an upgraded pistol. The stats for each upgraded version increase. The quick shooter shoots quicker and hits harder, the 6-shooter shoots a little further and aim down sights faster. My favorite of the bunch was the upgraded 6-shooter, the inlaid 6-shooter. The quick shooter's fire rate and reload speed is unmatched, but
I love to reload during a battle. There's nothing like the feeling of slamming a long silver bullet into a well-greased chamber.
I enjoy all 3 pistols available. They each have their own strengths and purpose, but I think it'd be fun if there was a little more variety. Like having a repeating pistol, period appropriate for the time, and providing another option for a combination of high fire rate and damage. I mentioned it earlier though, the game is short, so having any more weapon variety would probably detract from the brief on-screen time each revolver already has. Where I think weapon variety is especially lacking is the other 2 weapon classes, rifles and shotguns. Or should I say rifle and shotgun. Let's start with the rifle. There are technically 2 in the game, what the game calls the rifle and the sawn-off rifle. The rifle is a lever-action rifle, firing powerful rounds at the highest range available in the game and has a large magazine size. It has an upgraded version, the golden rifle, which shoots faster and has a few more rounds in the chamber. The other rifle, the sawn-off rifle, is worse than the regular rifle in every way. I don't really understand its inclusion other than looking cool, of course. But it just deals less damage, has less range, and less ammo in the magazine than the regular rifle, though I think it might shoot a little faster. I picked up the sawn-off once through my 2 playthroughs for this video, remembered how bad it was, and quickly replaced it. The rifle was my go-to long weapon. It has a quick enough fire rate to mow down enemies, and it usually puts them down in 1 shot to the chest from short to medium ranges. Next up, we have the shotgun. Again, there are technically 2 in the game. There's the shotgun, very creative name, which is a double-barrel shotgun that rips and tears through enemies very effectively, though of course limiting you to only 2 shells per reload. It has an extremely short range, the damage falls off very quickly, and the buckshot spreads very wide. The other shotgun is a sawn-off shotgun, who could have guessed. Very similar to the sawn-off rifle, it's mostly just a worse version of the default shotgun, though it can be equipped as a sidearm, and you can even dual-wield them if you get a late-game skill. Sawn-off shotguns are fun, and they're an Old West staple of course, but come on, I'd rather have a revolver. Shotguns are fun to use, though very situational. Enemies are more often than not too far for them to be effective in most fights. Though when you can employ them, yeah, it's a shotgun, it's fun. With the concentration ability I mentioned earlier, giving shotguns unlimited ammo briefly, they can be disgustingly powerful. It's a good power trip. You also get dynamite at your disposal, regardless of what weapons you're deciding to carry. You can carry up to 4 bundles of dynamite at any time, choosing to equip them manually or using a quick throw key to toss them without putting your gun away. As is cowboy fashion, you can shoot the dynamite out of the air or while it's on the ground to detonate it prematurely, or just to look cooler. You can get 2 abilities that directly affect gameplay with dynamite. The generous skill, splitting your dynamite bundle into individual dynamite sticks, effectively creating a cluster bomb. And there's also the grenadier perk, allowing you to quickly hipfire at the dynamite you just threw without having to manually aim yourself. And now that we've talked about what you'll be killing with and how you'll be killing, get ready for what you'll be killing. There's not a whole lot of enemy variety in the game, I'll be frank. There's I think 6 enemy types: regular bandits with a single revolver or rifle, a shotgunner bandit, a dual-wielding quick-footed bandit, a dynamite-wielding and wearing bandit, shield-wearing bandits, and armored bandits. You don't have to do anything specific against these enemies, except for the shield wielders, the game calls them shielders, which require you to flank them or shoot them through the peephole on their shield. The rest just have different firearms that you'll have to deal with. There are a handful of unique elements to them though. The dynamite bandits wear bandoliers of dynamite that you can shoot to use them as improvised bombs. The shotgunners have a little more health and the armored guys have even more health. There's a single level where you have to avoid a sharpshooter, and I wish this would have been explored or utilized a little bit more, just to mix things up. All in all though, enemy variety is pretty lacking. On top of that, the game does have you fighting different enemies of different factions. You'll be fighting American gunslingers and Native American warriors, though for some reason the Native American enemies just use the same old guns that the gun-wielding bandits do. I wish they'd play into the native culture a bit with their weapons, having you learn to counter their weaponry like slower moving projectiles with arrows or maybe some hunting traps turned against Silas, making their levels feel a bit more tense. Other than these default grunt type enemies, the game has a couple of boss fights it throws at you. Told you I'd wrap back around to these. I'm gonna go through each of the boss fights in the game. There's only 5 traditional bosses, while there are 9 duels, more cinematic, flashy, non-traditional boss fights. Going through the traditional bosses first, we have Old Man Clanton. This boss feels right out of 2004. A character has a minigun, cannon, or Gatling gun in this case, and the player is expected to dodge between obvious cover, slowly getting closer to the gunner. That's all this fight does, there's no twist or excitement added. You get up around Clanton's side and you can gun him down or blow him up. Next, we'll be fighting Curly Bill, a bullet sponge dual-wielding revolvers, running in between cover and ambushing the player in his arena. This is probably the most creative of the boss fights, unfortunately. The arena lends itself to slightly more engaging gameplay, having to try and keep Curly Bill's location in mind during the fight. Some grunts run in throughout the fight, and that's it. Another boss we fight is Henry Plummer. He throws dynamite at the player continuously, potentially teaching the player to shoot dynamite out of the air, which is fun. You shoot him when he dashes between covers, some basic enemies spawn throughout to shoot at you occasionally, not much else. Those are pretty much the only thing the game does with boss fights. A planted machine gun boss that you slowly whittle down, or a regular guy with a big health bar for no reason. I guess Henry Plummer is unique in this regard since he's the only one that's fought in that way during his boss fight. I don't really feel any need to go in depth with the rest of the named bosses. Again, it's just those 2 concepts recycled with different arenas. Ironically, the other 9 non-traditional cinematic bosses are much more interesting and engaging. They're framed as classic Old West duels with Silas facing down his opponent, or even opponents, drawing their pistols in an honorable showdown. Again, I said there are 9 of these, almost double the amount of traditional bosses, and yet they keep these fresh and exciting throughout the entire game. The duels slowly add more mechanics almost each time you duel a character, creating an engaging experience every time for me. Your first duel will be against Sheriff Pat Garrett, and the game introduces you to the 2 cores of dueling, focusing your aim and your own reaction speed. You use the mouse, or right stick on a controller, to focus the reticle over your target's body. The reticle is floaty and fights you a bit, forcing you to stay on top of it to slowly increase your focus and make sure your shot will be more accurate. On top of this, you have to react quickly, hitting left click or the right trigger at the right time to draw your gun. There's an interesting choice in drawing your gun. You can choose to draw your gun before your opponent, giving you what the game calls a dishonorable kill, awarding you less XP for the kill. Or you can steal your nerves, allowing your opponent to draw their gun first, giving them the opportunity to shoot you but awarding you with an honorable kill, awarding more XP. The next duel against Bob Ollinger asks you to start keeping your draw speed in mind, different from your reaction speed. This forces the player to use the A and D key, or the controller's left stick, to keep Silas's hand positioned above his gun in his holster, again giving you a little resistance, asking you to divide your attention between your aim and now your draw speed. Higher draw speeds will, of course, draw your gun at a higher speed, allowing you to aim at your target sooner. The third duel is more of the same, but the one after that introduces dodging bullets. Now, once the player has drawn their gun, if the opponent is faster than the player has a chance to dodge their bullets, using A or D or the left stick to weave to each side to avoid gunfire. The duel after this has you faced off against 2 opponents, the Dalton brothers, both gunning for Silas. This expects you to master all the components introduced so far, having to lock in your aim and get your quick draw ready to gun down each man, dodging bullets from both. The next 2 duels are again mastery of the duel system, though against only one opponent, but both quicker and faster opponents than before, which pays off for our final real duel. The height of the excitement of the duels is a 3-way standoff between Silas, Butch Cassidy, and the Sundance Kid. This is different from the Dalton brothers duel with 2 opponents, as those 2 were both interested in taking down Silas, while this duel has all 3 parties ready to shoot each other. You now have to use the Q and E keys, or left and right bumpers, to swap between each target as they have their focus on you. If the opponent isn't focused on you, you will not gain any focus, losing your accuracy. Mind you, you still have to keep your draw speed in mind and keep an eye on who draws first, being able to react quick enough to draw yourself. I love these duels. They are dramatic, over the top, and most importantly, fun. They keep you on your toes with new mechanics through the story that forces you into a balancing act between all of these mechanics. They're great, they're a much better climax for a level than the other boss fights, and thankfully, again, there's more of these than there are traditional fights. If you were paying attention and keeping count, you might have noticed I only mentioned 8 duel sequences here. The 9th is the final encounter of the game, which is a binary choice in the narrative, and I don't want to spoil that in case someone skipped the story section. I understand the inclusion of the traditional boss fights. Breaking up gameplay and giving some diversity of content instead of just doing these duels is a good decision. I just wish the traditional fights were more interesting, I guess, or at the very least more modern. They really do feel like they were pulled from 10 years prior to the game's release. Speaking of spoilers, there will be a bit more here for the general vibe of the story in the game. Not any specific details, but fun twists on the interactive storytelling medium. So skip to the now second timecode on screen if you don't want some truths about our main character spoiled, or if you don't want some gameplay elements revealed to you. Silas lies a lot, or he misremembers a lot, or he at least makes things a little more exciting for the sake of his stories. I've talked at length about that in the narrative section of the video, and I mentioned a few of these moments in gameplay, but I want to highlight a few of my favorites of these moments. Silas will lower the player's ammo count for the sake of making the stakes in his story more exciting and interesting. Silas will change the level design in front of the player to fit his narrative better, adding ladders and walkways where they weren't previously, or even entirely changing the environment and geography of the area for his convenience. Silas will change the enemies he's fighting simply through him misremembering what he's saying, or just to keep his audience on his toes and listening to him. I love these little moments. I wish more games did things like this, allowing an unreliable narrator to affect the player directly, rather than just narrating the story and adding exposition that you might distrust. I don't really know where else to mention this, but since we're winding down on the gameplay in the core of Gunslinger in the campaign, I guess it'll fit here. Gunslinger has 3 difficulties: normal, hard, and true west. I played through the game on hard first for this video to refamiliarize myself with the game and its controls. Gunslinger is a pretty hard game. I like to think that I'm alright at shooters, and I died pretty consistently in this game, especially in the extended survival sections. They can go on pretty long and you go down in just a few shots. I played through the game for a second time on True West. You unlock this difficulty when you finish the game. The enemies hit even harder, and now the HUD, or heads-up display, is entirely disabled, other than hit markers when you land a shot on enemies. I like this mode a lot. Granted, I played through this time on New Game Plus, retaining all my skills and upgraded weapons from the beginning, but I think it was a lot of fun and is worth your time for a replay. It's fun to run through the game with all your skills, where you might have only had a brief chance to see some late game ones, and you'll likely fill out all 3 skill trees during this playthrough, so you get to see Silas at his full, legendary gunslinger status. Aside from the main campaign, the game has 2 extra game modes you can play through. The first, simply called Arcade Mode. Arcade Mode is a test of the player's skill in the core gameplay. It's a time attack mode where you're expected to kill every enemy in the level in one continuous kill combo while running through the trial as fast as you can. You can enter with 3 different classes, representing each playstyle: a pistol loadout, a rifle loadout, and a shotgun loadout. Each loadout levels up the more you use it throughout Arcade Mode, gaining perks related to the playstyle. The levels are ripped straight from the main campaign, though you'll usually fight through them in a different direction from where Silas went in the story, with much different, much more numerous enemy spawns. It's an entertaining mode, it's fun to try and get the highest score you can or earn all 3 stars for each level. I played through a couple of these while making this video if I just wanted a quick injection of Gunslinger gameplay. It'll give you that fix pretty easily. I think it's worth checking out. Here's a couple of my scores if you want to say you're better than a YouTube video essayist at an 11-year-old single-player game. The other mode you can try your hand at is the Duel mode. It's a gauntlet of 15 duels back-to-back, with you only having 5 lives or attempts to take them all down. You get judged based on your aim, your reaction time, draw speed, all the mechanics of dueling get judged here. The duels get progressively more difficult as you go on, and you get to duel some extra characters from the story, getting to see them in greater detail or just up close for the first time, which I guess is neat. Again, here's my score for my attempt. I ran through the mode once, all the way to the end, and at that point I had my fill of duels to not try for a better score. Call of Juarez Gunslinger has aged nicely for the most part. It is 11 years old, so taking a close inspection on some textures or effects will show their age, but Gunslinger has a strong art style that really helped it look timeless. You've probably noticed, Gunslinger has a cel-shaded style. Cel shading is when 3D animation or art tries to mimic the look of comic books or hand-drawn animation, usually through the use of dark, sharp edges against vibrant, flat coloring. This style has been around for a while in games. I think Jet Set Radio popularized cel shading in gaming, and now many more games have taken their shot at the form. I like cel shading. I think it's an appealing look for most games that try it, and I especially think using a unique art style or look for your game can help its appearance in the long run, keeping it timeless. Gunslinger nails cel shading. It harshes those dark edges and outlines on the things you want to look at: enemies, your guns, important geometry, and the level. The coloration is vibrant, more than you'd expect from a Western. Westerns tend to go for gritty realism, a bleak look for a bloody period in time. Gunslinger throws that to the side for saturated, bright, and lively environments, even if it is a lot of deserts, caves, and ghost towns. It isn't afraid to let the sun brighten up the area, breathing some life and color anywhere you look. The game still looks fantastic on a macro level. The environments can be gorgeous, and I stopped to appreciate the scenery a handful of times throughout my 2 playthroughs. The game as a whole really tries to sell the hand-drawn elements of the world, maybe going for being a classical animation. When the player takes damage, instead of the typical edge bleed that a lot of first-person shooters employ, Gunslinger saps the color from the screen, letting a sepia tone fill in. On top of this, the screen becomes full of bullet holes, literally ripping through the screen the story is being shown to you on. The art and presentation extend into the cutscenes as well, their graphic novel-esque drawings presenting to the player as stills of the scene in a striking comic book form. A lot of games tend to do these to save money on entirely animating scenes and characters, syncing them to voiceover, framing, and lighting them properly for the player. A lot of work goes into cutscenes, you should appreciate them. Anyways, I think these graphic novel scenes play well with Gunslinger. With the cel-shaded nature of the rest of the game, it was probably a direct consideration, so the two have a symbiotic relationship, bolstering each to sell their presentation. An extension of these cutscenes come in character introductions, through dramatic comic panels to introduce key players throughout the story. I always love these, in any game really, it's such a fun way to introduce somebody. There's one for I think every bounty target in the game, and every time I just sat there and watched cause they look so good. Some things do look a little rough. Some visual effects can look pretty dated. Fire especially looks bad if you take a second to look at it. On a closer level, if you're looking for those texture seams, fuzzy, low poly models, you'll find them. But the game still looks fantastic in motion, and a lot of that is in part to the animation throughout Gunslinger. Everything in Gunslinger animates in an exaggerated, cartoonish way, again helping sell the overall look and feel of the game. Characters run out of cover in mad dashes, their deaths look like something right out of your local high school play, and they fire their guns like they're bad extras on a movie set. It's all fun and bombastic, and I think that's what they were going for. A lot of westerns from the past are known for their melodramatic acting, their over-the-top performances. Some of these have been lovingly called spaghetti westerns, Western media created in Italy for international audiences. The performances in those movies aren't very serious, or good, frankly, and I think Gunslinger might be trying to replicate this. Animations for the player, on the other hand, man, I love watching Silas work. The way Silas handles guns exudes style and confidence, and the animations only get better as you level up, which is a fun addition. Silas reloads guns competently and dramatically, with quick but purposeful movement. As you unlock skills to increase reload speed, the animation will change. With revolvers, he manually rotates the cylinder with one hand, sliding rounds into the chamber one by one with his other hand. Once you unlock the upgrade, Silas spins the chamber, allowing it to revolve on its own, and Silas skillfully places each cartridge into the chamber with speed. There's new animations for every weapon class as you upgrade skills. It's a nice touch that immediately got my attention. There's detail and love for how the guns will be cocked, reloaded, fired, and flourished. Where Silas's animations fall flat in my eyes are with his melee and quick throw animations. For melee, it's floaty and weirdly slow, it barely looks like it connects with enemies, and it never feels good to pull off. With the dynamite quick throw, it feels like maybe 6 frames of animation are on screen. I don't know, it gets the job done. The dynamite flies in front of you, but it creates a hard contrast between the detailed animations for gun handling. Don't get me wrong, 6 frames of animation is fine. I think Doom 2's Super Shotgun reload is literally 7 frames, and that's still one of the hardest reloads I've ever seen. It's just a weird contrast and disparity that I noticed. The HUD or heads-up display in Gunslinger is extremely minimal. You have at any given time an ammo counter, a concentration meter, and a sense of death meter. That's pretty much it. When you get a new objective, it appears at the top of the screen in a mostly unobtrusive box, with a little star that guides you as a waypoint through the level if you need it. A radial menu comes up when you swap guns. This I could do without, but I get its inclusion for the sake of keeping track of what to press to equip what guns. Additionally, there are pop-ups for every enemy you kill, though not in a distracting way, more of an effective means to let you know that you've finished them off, and to let you know how you did so, with the different trick kills that you can perform. You'll also get a little notification about leveling up, which I do think hampers the appearance on screen as it doesn't go away until you enter the menu. But I mean, hey, you probably want to spend that skill point anyways. I love all of this. Really, only the gun swapping menu bothers me. I love when a game can take a chance on a cinematic presentation and not overwhelm you with the details. All you need to know is how much ammo you have left, you need to know if you can dodge a bullet, and you need to know where to go sometimes. And this extends even further in the True West difficulty. I mentioned it earlier, but it pretty much disables all of the HUD except for the weapon radial menu and objective updates, if you press a key to prompt them. I love it. It makes the game even more scenic and it lets you focus on the action. Something I especially dislike in any game, this isn't a note against Gunslinger really, just a pretty common design choice, is when a game pauses to tutorialize something to you. I get it. I did something or will be doing something and you want me to know how to do it, but please don't take control away from me. Gunslinger's prompts are brief and to the point. You can read them in about 2 seconds, but still, for that first playthrough, it can create a lot of awkward pauses. I want to make special note of how duels are framed throughout the game. I love how they look and how seriously the game tries to sell them. The game drops you down to the perspective of Silas's holster, his hand hovering just above and his sightline on his target. The camera slowly zooms and tightens as your aim focuses and the tension builds, all for it to zoom back out once guns are drawn, and the game holds on to the tension with time being slowed. Visible bullet trails zipping by with bright, colorful muzzle flashes, ending with Silas twirling his gun back into its holster. I love these sections. I'll gush a little more about duels in the audio section, but they deserve all of the bravado I've given them. All that being said, Gunslinger has aged like a fine wine in my eyes. She's just as beautiful as the day we met. Alright, so the game looks great still, but what about how it sounds? Yeah, still great. I want to start off with something that would probably go unappreciated through a normal playthrough of this game. Ambient audio. This is audio to really sell the world or environment that you're in. The ambience of a forest, with a stream running past you, birds chirping in the trees, while the wind carries everything with a slight breeze. This game doesn't need all of that, yet it has it in every level. If you stop and wait a moment outside of a gunfight, outside of Silas's narration, you'll hear it and it's wonderful. This level of detail and care extends into the sounds you'll be hearing more often too. The gunshots, the footsteps, the explosions. Guns sound punchy, they hit hard and sound harder. They'll give a satisfying crack from the player's guns and whiz by in a whimsical way when you're avoiding enemy fire. It all sounds great. When you activate concentration, everything slows down and the sound fades out. just you and your guns, mowing down whatever's in front of you. Everything sounds spot on. You can detect where you're being shot from just by where it sounds like it came from. You'll hear different materials that you're stepping on. Hell, you'll probably know what you're being shot at with if you play the game enough. I mentioned continuing my love for the duels in the audio section, so here we are. Every duel in the game is accompanied by the same track, a dramatic haze of bells and drum beats, slowly fading out as your focus trains on your target. Then, all you can hear is Silas's heartbeat, and the deep breaths that either him or his opponent are drawing. Until you both unholster your pistols and all that plays is the ticking clock of each millisecond passing, until the snap of your guns firing. A brief stinger plays once your target is dead, not an exciting one, but something almost foreboding. The quality of the audio design extends into the voice acting as well. I don't think there's any particularly weak performance from the main speaking cast. The random enemy barks and lines are a bit silly and weak, but they aren't meant to be the center of attention. They are just added for the player's amusement rather than being a believable aspect of the world. Hell, half the time Silas speaks over or even speaks for the people he's talking to in his stories.
Billy looked at me and said, "About time, amigo! Grab a gun and get to the window!"
Again, the main cast shines, with some pretty big names voicing our protagonist and a major character, Ben, John Seigan, and Paul Eiding respectively. And every performance kills it, I think. You get a feel for their characters through their voice, their mannerisms when speaking, and their delivery. You can tell that Silas is larger than life.
Don't believe everything you read in them dime novels, boy.
You can tell that Ben is nervous around Silas.
So, Bob Bryant got away?
You can hear the excitement Dwight has to be speaking to a legend like Silas. It's all phenomenal.
Well, sir, it would be an honor if you would allow me to buy you a beer.
And now I get to gush about the soundtrack. In case it hasn't been made clear yet, Call of Juarez Gunslinger loves old westerns. And so do I. I think this appreciation comes through the clearest in the soundtrack throughout the game. These sad acoustic strings accompanied by droning bass building up to bombastic tunes with electric guitars and synths, somehow still fitting in the vibe of a western. Every song you'll hear sounds great. You wouldn't think twice about their placement and they'll fade into the experience of the game. And while that might sound like a negative note, the song fading into the overall experience, it's also a sign of a great soundtrack, one that you don't even notice is getting you pumped or tricking you into stealing your gaze during a duel. There are some standout tracks in the score, and not standing out in a bad way by any means. I played a bit of this in the story section, but John Seigan's rendition of Oh Death is a hauntingly beautiful moment in an otherwise action-packed game.
Oh, death. Oh, death. Won't you spare me over till another year?
And don't get me started on the Ballad of Silas Greaves. This song almost convinced me to pick up line dancing.
There are men who fear legends, but a man legends fear. He's a four-hosted reaper, crying bullets for tears.
Again, the game knocks it out of the park with its overall presentation, the audios, the visuals, all of it. Gunslinger just oozes appreciation, passion, care, and love for its inspiration. The game is just a blast to play, to see, and listen to, coming from someone that geeks over westerns. There's a couple of things that I didn't really know where else to mention. A couple notes that I want to share, so I want to throw them right here before the conclusion. I mentioned a caveat to my recommendation of playing this game at the top of the video, for anyone that would be interested on playing on PC. And here it is. This game does not run out of the box, meaning you can't just go buy this off of Steam or GOG and boot it up to play. It takes some finagling. Granted, it is extremely easy to do, but it is inexcusable for a more modern release to not work as intended on modern hardware. There's dozens of guides to figure out how to get the game up and running 100% of the time. I'll link one below in the description, but I wanted to make this abundantly clear to anyone interested in playing the game. I feel like it's only fair that I do that after recommending it so thoroughly. I don't want to run defense for something like this, but I do believe that Ubisoft, the title's original publisher, plays some part in this. Gunslinger and its predecessor, The Cartel, were delisted in 2018, being entirely removed from digital storefronts, Gunslinger being a digital-only title. Thankfully, Gunslinger has been restored to online retailers, though The Cartel has not made a return and likely never will. I mention Ubisoft here because a lot of their titles suffer from things like this. They have no support for modern hardware, and running them on modern machines takes some effort and extra work. However, I don't think Techland themselves are entirely absolved of any blame. Techland unfortunately doesn't seem to have any interest in the Call of Juarez franchise, as much as it pains me to say, past placing Gunslinger back in front of consumers. There's been no news of any sort about the franchise since the release and the reinstatement of Gunslinger. All anyone has seen of the series was an outfit for the player character in Dying Light 2. Some legacy, huh? Techland has seemingly pivoted away from the franchise, focusing on their zombie survival games like Dead Island and Dying Light, which is fine and fair. Hell, I even like those games. Though they have recklessly abandoned quite a few of their other new projects along the way, like entirely giving up on Dead Island 2, putting their Hellraid franchise in an indefinite hold, and shutting down their cash-in on the Battle Royale craze. I say all of this because frankly, Techland should be ashamed of the way this game is treated. Sure, it's just an 11-year-old single-player game that doesn't run anymore on modern processors. Who cares? They should. It's an embarrassment for Techland and only detracts from more people falling in love with Gunslinger like I have. What do you expect me to say at the end of this video? I've been gushing about Gunslinger for the past hour, and now I have to close it all out in a final statement? Okay. Gunslinger is a fantastic game. It's one of those couple dozen games that I revisit every few years. It's a love letter to Western media, and that shines through every aspect of the game, from playing it to just listening. It's not a perfect game. It's not even my favorite game, but there's so much love and care put into the setting and themes that it wins me over despite any flaws I might have with the game. Again, those being the brevity of its content and the repetitive structure of levels and missions, along with far below par technical support of the title in recent time. But despite all of that, it has an engaging story that plays with the player's perception and usual understanding of how a narrative in a game is structured, toying with the player and even hindering them in some cases, just for the sake of an old bounty hunter's ego. There aren't many games like Gunslinger to me, just a huge statement of love, appreciation, and celebration for a medium and a setting. And that's why you should play Call of Juarez Gunslinger. Hey again, it's the end of the video. You could probably already tell that. I just wanted to come in at the end here and speak as I have at the end of my last two videos, just kind of clarify on some things or just kind of talk about the process of making this, or whatever, right? Whatever I want to talk about. It's my video. First and foremost, of course, I want to say thank you for watching this video. If you've made it this far, clearly you've watched the video, and thank you for that. I'm pretty proud of this one. I would go as far as saying that it's my favorite video that I've made. Not just because it's the shortest, but obviously it's a game that I really love, and I think that I did it justice. I just think that, you know, the culmination of the work on the last two videos really came together, and maybe this one turned out pretty good. But speaking of those last two videos, the last one, the Star Wars Outlaws video, has over 16,000 views right now. As I am recording this at 2 in the morning on a Monday before I check in for work in a couple hours. Yeah, no, 16,000 views on that video is insane, and something that I would have never guessed that I would get on any of these. I'm just a guy talking about games, and yeah, I'm just kind of winging it. But 16,000 people watched that video, a good chunk of them subscribed, a lot of them liked it, and that's all cool, that's all great. I'm deeply appreciative of all of that. So thank you if you watched that one and you're here now. That's awesome. Regarding some things in this video, I do want to point out, or I guess call myself out, for some inconsistent voiceover audio quality. I recorded this over the course of a couple months. I mentioned it in the Outlaws video, but I actually started working on the Gunslinger video almost immediately after my first video on State of Decay. Outlaws came out, I really didn't like it, so I felt like I had to make a video, and this got put on the back burner, so there's some audio, some editing, some bits and bobs that are from 3 months ago, prior to what I had learned and things that I feel like I've improved since making the Outlaws video. So if you noticed, that might be why, or I'm just lazy and I didn't fix it. And I also wanted to point out a few things that I didn't necessarily talk about in this video. I didn't really know where to put a couple things. This script kind of got pared down quite a bit. One thing I wanted to talk about, but I didn't really know how to like spin it in a positive light. It's something I like, but it's kind of something that most people would maybe look down on, is Gunslinger's heavy use, or I guess reuse, of assets and levels. So throughout the game, it reuses a lot of levels. Like, I think every small desert town is the same town, you just kind of come at it from a different angle and they kind of light it in a way that maybe you're not looking at certain things or you're facing different ways, and it's really clever, but it's all the same town. It's kind of insane. So I kind of wanted to talk about that and their very interesting use and reuse of models and assets, and their maps, which are all just one giant level. Everything's on like a single plane. It's really interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I didn't really know how to spin that positively enough to where I liked it, but I wanted to talk about it. Other than that, I think I cut out a lot of talking about some of the more minor characters in the story. Like Dwight in the story is actually Dwight Eisenhower. It's a kind of weird Easter egg or like thing that they just included. At the very end of the game, someone mentions that he's going to West Point or something, and he's going to like study law, or I don't know what Dwight Eisenhower did. He's Dwight Eisenhower, and it's just a weird offhanded thing at the very end of the game. And I didn't really know where to mention that, so it didn't come up. And I don't really talk about Seth or Jack or Molly much because they don't really add anything. I had a bit of a description of everybody in the bar, but I think the story's really just about Silas and Ben. I think those are the like two biggest parts of the script that came out on the cutting room floor. So I just kind of wanted to bring them up here in a less formal way. I think that's all I got. I think that's all I've got for the end of video rambling for this one. Yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you so much for subscribing if you're subscribed. I didn't mention that like went up by 150% from before I posted the Outlaws video, so that was also crazy. Yeah, thank you so much, and I hope to see you in the next one. The next video I think I'm going to be putting out is going to be a bit different from my last three. I want to talk about an early access title that I've been playing, and I just kind of want to shine a spotlight on it and point it out to anyone that might be interested. So stay tuned to see what game that might be. Thank you very much again, and I hope you check in for the next video.